Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, and we will begin a 5-part series entitled The Language of Mental Illness. We will talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD. We will talk about bipolar disorder or manic depressive. We will also talk about attachment disorders. We will discuss schizophrenia. And we will finally end with antisocial behavioral disorders. Have you ever been in a major auto accident? What about the sounds that goes with that? What about the startle effects that went with the auto accident? If there was physical injury, what about the pain and the other details of the incident? Have you ever witnessed a robbery, especially if it had a dangerous weapon? Do you recall the emotions, the fright, the fear, the sense of helplessness, the anger that you felt? Once the imminent danger, the threat, or even the setting was no longer around, how easily aroused were you to almost feeling similar to when you were actually in the direct danger of the automobile accident or in the midst of an armed robbery? When we talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome, we're not talking about the physical reenactment of the original event, but rather, according to the U.S. National Library of Medicine, it defines post-traumatic stress syndrome as an anxiety disorder that typically has its onset if people have prior seen or if people have prior experienced a traumatizing event that either caused them or potentially could have caused injury or even death. So the post-traumatization comes after the original trauma impact. Post-traumatic stress syndrome has no age barriers, but it's more driven by an assault that took place, domestic violence that happens, war, rape, terror attacks. These are the things that trigger an after-event stress in such a way that the person's anxiety escalates almost to a point where if there are any remote similarities later in life that are similar to the episode that caused the trauma, it's almost as if the person is back into the original traumatizing event. The National Institute of Mental Health has grouped post-traumatic stress syndrome or PTSD syndromes into 3 primary categories. First is the re-experiencing symptoms. It's when people have flashbacks, bad dreams, or frightening thoughts about the original traumatizing event. The second category is that of avoidance. The symptoms causes the individual to stay away from certain places, to avoid certain events, or to stay away or stay from around certain objects that are reminders of the bad experience. They may have no interest in activities that once were really exciting. There may be feelings of numbness, and there may be depression and perpetual worry about the imminent danger reappearing in the future. And then there's another arena, a primary area called hyperarousal symptoms. It's where the person is easily startled. They are extremely on edge, and it appears as if they are always fidgety. They have difficulty sleeping, and if the most reminiscent thing happens, they could explode into very angry outbursts. How do you treat post-traumatic stress syndrome? Oftentimes, there are three primary approaches. One is to make every effort to desensitize the individual from what has traumatized them. In the process of desensitization, you're trying to help the person settle down, not be as anxious, and understand that in the present environment, they are not in the imminent danger that triggered the fear, whether it was the car wreck, whether it was in an armed robbery, whether it was a rape, whether it was domestic violence. You're trying to say to the person that where you are, what you're hearing, what you're seeing is not a precursor to what you have experienced. That's desensitization. And then the second most effective way to approach post-traumatic stress is through support groups. Support groups are made up not only of the leaders of the group, but it is also comprised of people who have experienced the trauma of a similar nature. They have been traumatized by rape. They've been traumatized by domestic violence. They've been traumatized by war. They've been traumatized by terrorist attacks. So they can all identify in some way with other people in the group. And they began to share coping mechanisms, and they began to share how they were startled or their sleep patterns being disrupted, or how it has impacted their families in some positive and some negative ways. The third approach to treatment is the need for anti-anxiety medications. So many times, in order for the person to settle down, it could be so far gone that the only help that can move the person into being available for desensitization and available for group support is some type antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication. And oftentimes that becomes the most difficult thing to get a person to buy into, because normally it's associated erroneously with, if I take medication, then that means something is wrong with me. That means that I'm unstable. But the medication simply helps the individual be available for the desensitization and available to participate in the support groups. When we look at post-traumatic stress, let me recap by saying it causes a person to re-experience the flashbacks, the dreams, the frightening thoughts. It also causes an individual to want to avoid at any cost. They stay away from closed-in spaces. They will stay away from high-rise buildings. There may be a fear of flying. They will avoid that at any cost. They will even avoid 4th of July celebrations if there are fireworks. They will avoid, if at all possible, riding in a car if they were traumatized by a car wreck. And then there's the hyperarousal, where the person is easily startled. With this, be very careful not to sneak up on a person. Don't play practical jokes with the individual, because they are easily aroused and they are always on edge, even when other individuals do not see why they are so upset. They can't sleep. They're very restless. It may appear as if it's taken less time for them to sleep. They may only sleep 2 or 3 hours, and that's because of physical exhaustion. whereas most people may sleep 7 to 8 hours. So post-traumatic stress syndrome is a very critical, it's a very serious thing that I hope we all take serious, not just if we're involved, but to become more interested and more concerned about those who experience it. I'll see you back in class again next time. Don't be late and don't skip class.